when we look at what other things are out there, and this comes from a cost-effective analysis, you've got the Le Bonheur pathway is like a clinical decision rule that is very much like pediatric appendicitis score. So it seems to perform a little bit better. CT performs a little bit better. But ultrasound, this is a meta-analysis data from radiologists. This is pretty equivalent to what we just showed. And it certainly is a bit better than emergency department clinician's judgment. But surprisingly, look at how good overnight observation on a surgical service is. So interesting things are like now, well, which of these things should we choose once we start to know these things? What's the why and why do this? Well, this is what our emergency department looks like in the winter in terms of number of patients per hour. And you can see that for at least half of the day, we have somewhere around 60 to 80 or higher patients in the department that we're trying to turn through quickly and not miss a single case. You don't want to get M&M'd, right? You don't want to miss somebody with something. But 1/3 of these patients present with abdominal pain. So it's this huge volume that you're trying to get right. And you're trying to do that without being like, well, why don't I just send every kid with abdominal pain for a radiological ultrasound, right? Some people would say, well, maybe that's not cost effective. When you look at all the other tests available to you as the person who has to decide which of these pathways am I going to engage, you have a history, a physical, lab tests. And this is before you go and access imaging, right, or access an admission. And you have ways of putting them together like the pediatric appendicitis score. And so here's what we know about the positive and negative likelihood ratios associated with each of those things. So it makes sense that when you get down here to the pediatric appendicitis scores, that are ways of combining these things, that the positive likelihood ratios, they start to get to that level of 6, which is the likelihood ratios we feel like really help you in taking your odds ratio and combining it with a likelihood ratio and getting a bit more math on your post odds ratio and then doing a conversion back to a post-test probability. And then you add in ED POCUS, and it outperforms everything that we know about all the other steps. Now, people will say this is beginnings of this literature, right? Does it really? This isn't just Adam Sivett's numbers. So you saw his were like 11. So this group took the few other papers that were out there and meta-analyzed them, and it does drift down a little bit towards not 11, just down to 9.
Yeah, around to, still 12.
Yeah.
You need to know which is the experience of these programs.
Yeah, so these were people where it is a range when in these papers of experience. The papers include like how many scans were done by what person, but it's certainly a range. Yeah. And this is where we're heading, right? So what people will say is that you need to know your pretest probability for a patient. So someone who has some combination of those features, they're not like, oh my God, this patient has an 80%, but they're that one where you're like, I think I need testing instead of like, I only need testing to satisfy people who want testing, but this kid for sure has appendicitis. This is a kid that like, yeah, they wince. Yeah, they could. Maybe I need to test more. I'm not sure. So from the literature in that group, people will say the probability they have appendicitis is 42.8%. That's the established pretest probability. And what we're trying to do with any test that we apply is then say, can I now do nothing more for this patient? Do I have to keep testing, or am I done because I'm convinced they have appendicitis? And so you end up with charts like this, where you can then overlay, well, how does a positive or a negative post-test probability after ED POCUS, where does that put the patient? And really interesting stuff, like it puts them in a continue testing zone. If they're negative, you can't fully say like, I don't need to do any more testing, but a positive puts them at a post-test probability of 87%, so essentially 90%. And for these authors, they would say that puts you in a I'm done testing. You know, I shouldn't be sending this patient for a radiology test. I should be accessing my surgeons to say I have a patient with a 90% probability of appendicitis. Could you come see. Now, we know in reality, we're still going to get the answer, could you continue testing? But this is the direction that a lot of this literature is heading in. And then the even more interesting thing to me is that you can start comparing all these different ways that we could take these patients and look at cost effectiveness, right? Why not just admit everybody for overnight observation if the sensitivity and specificity are so high? Why not send every single patient who shows up with abdominal pain for an ultrasound if ultrasound is good? And so to answer that gets less into what's the sensitivity and specificity and more into what's the cost associated with these pathways. And so Jay Pershad out of Le Bonheur Children's Hospital in the States has done that in these computer models. We went over his one on shunts not long ago, VP shunts, but he also did this kind of approach with, let's just pick out the costs associated with all these things. And here's examples of all those costs of the different tests or interventions you have to do, but also the costs of like missing things, like a patient with a misdiagnosis returns with complicated appendicitis. If you can know what your cost is, and you can plug it in to computer models like this, where every single pathway the patient could take is modeled, and you could start comparing these things for what's most cost effective. So CT, everybody, is not cost effective because it's expensive and it causes downstream cancers that cost the system money. Ultrasound all, when they did this approach, I think they were hoping to find that like the Le Bonheur pathway, a mixed pathway of lab tests and physical exam would be the most cost effective. It allowed you to access or not access ultrasound depending on how things went. But they found that ultrasounding everybody was the most cost effective pathway in terms of, you don't have to worry as much about misses. It's not that expensive a test.
Bedside or comprehensive? Or
comprehensive. So if ultrasound everybody comprehensive is the most cost effective, but point of care ultrasound has the same test characteristics and no associated cost, what's most cost effective? So that's, I think, the next stuff we have to do in terms of research. It makes sense to me that if you get good at being a point of care sonographer, and one of the arguments is a good clinician might be a cost-effective intervention. Well, a good clinician with point of care ultrasound, doesn't that sound like the combination of ultrasound everybody and these clinical exams? So talk to me in 10 years, talk to me in 15 years, and I might have something I've done. And when you look at like, well, how do we say it's most cost effective? So you have to take like a baseline cost for all of these different strategies. And then this thing at the end here, this incremental cost effectiveness ratio, is essentially how much does it cost to avoid one misdiagnosis in either direction? So you're either false positive or false negative. How much does it cost your health system to avoid that? So if you ultrasound everybody, that's the baseline state, because they found it to be most cost effective. And then you compare the other ones to how much more expensive are they to be better, to avoid one miss. So the Le Bonheur, you have to spend $17,000 per patient to avoid one miss. An observation stay is $75,000. So that idea of like, well, why don't you just admit everybody instead of ultrasounding everybody? Because it costs per miss $75,000 more. And I'll end with, because I love this topic, so I go and I talk too much. But I'll end with another future direction. Okay, so maybe we're going to be able to prove that good clinician sonographers are the most cost-effective way of assessing these patients. But what if non-operative treatment for appendicitis really starts to take off, right? This idea that, like everything else infective in kids, we're starting to move towards, why don't you just give them antibiotics and see how they do? Oh, you got a retropharyngeal abscess, a peritonsillar abscess, a big goopy necrotic node. Just get IV antibiotics for a day or two on the general pediatrics floor. And if you start looking better, then you get discharged home and you follow up with that surgical service. So why not appendicitis? How much more cost effective would it be to say, this kid seems to have uncomplicated appendicitis. I'm admitting them to general pediatrics. Surgery will see them tomorrow to see how they're doing. When they start getting better, they go home. And they can come back to the surgery service in a month to see how they're doing and when do we schedule their interval appendectomy or not. Like, how much more cost effective and maybe safe would that be than saying every patient with appendicitis needs to come into hospital to get slotted into a general surgery schedule that's not anticipating them for surgery now. So we need to know more about the efficacy and safety of non-operative treatment. But then if we do head in that direction, how many of those kids do I start to diagnose with appendicitis based on my history, physical, point-of-care ultrasound, and send home with my script for antibiotics and book them as an outpatient, and surgery doesn't necessarily need to see them in the emergency room? So these are the kinds of directions we might get led into with point-of-care ultrasound. I mean, the next is that we learn how to do bedside appendectomy, right? That's just the next. Point-of-care surgery.